A little beggar saves a millionaire from an accident, and her request leaves him speechless. It was a typical morning in the big city. The sun barely pierced through the gray clouds hovering on the horizon. Mary, a 12-year-old girl, wandered the busy streets. Her clothes were worn, her sneakers nearly falling apart, and her hair tied back in a messy ponytail. Despite her appearance, there was something in her eyes, a spark of determination that the world had not yet extinguished. She watched the movement of the main avenue, where luxury cars passed as if oblivious to the chaos around them. Mary was about to cross the street when she noticed something unusual. A tall, well-dressed man, clearly distracted while looking at his phone, was walking toward the crosswalk, unaware of a car speeding toward him. Her heart raced. Mary didn't think twice. With impressive agility, she ran toward the man and pushed him out of harm's way with all her strength. The screeching of tires and the smell of burning rubber filled the air as the car missed them by mere inches before disappearing down the road. Edward, the man Mary had saved, fell to the ground, confused and shaken. His leather briefcase burst open, scattering papers everywhere. He looked up at the girl, who was breathing heavily, and saw a mix of fear and courage in her expression. Yet in that vulnerable moment, another thought crossed his mind. A sudden memory of his youth, when a stranger had once saved him in a moment of danger. A debt he had never thought to repay until now. Life is strange, he thought. Today, I was the one saved. Are you okay? Mary asked, her voice trembling but firm. It took Edward a few seconds to process what had just happened. He adjusted his suit while still sitting on the ground and finally responded, "Yes, I'm fine. You saved me. If it weren't for you." Mary, relieved, let out a faint smile. But before she could say anything else, Edward stood up and approached her, still in disbelief. "Do you realize what you just did? You risked your life to save someone you don't even know." She shrugged, trying to appear nonchalant. "Someone had to do something. I couldn't just stand there." Edward stayed silent for a moment, assessing the little heroine before him. He noticed the details, the worn-out clothes, her thin frame that suggested constant hunger, but also the dignity in her posture. Something inside him shifted in that moment. He extended his hand, introducing himself. "My name is Edward. And you, what's your name?" "Mary," she replied simply. "Well, Mary. What can I do to repay you for what you've done for me?" he asked, genuinely grateful. Mary hesitated, clearly surprised by the question. She hadn't expected a reward. Saving Edward had been a reflex, not a plan. After a brief silence, her eyes lit up with an idea. "I don't want money or fancy things, sir. I just want your help finding my mom." Edward, who had been ready to offer money or a luxurious gift, was taken aback. He looked at Mary more closely, realizing that this simple request carried a complex and painful story. And so, in a split second, both of their lives changed. What had started as an act of bravery now transformed into a bond neither of them had anticipated. Edward stood there, stunned by Mary's request. Of all the things she could have asked for, money, a place to live, or even food, she had asked him to help her find her mother. The weight of her words hung in the air as Edward processed the magnitude of what she had just revealed. "Your mother?" he asked, his voice softening. "What happened to her?" Mary looked down at the ground, shifting nervously. "She disappeared 2 years ago. One day she just didn't come home. I've been looking for her ever since." Edward's heart clenched. The determination in her voice was at odds with the vulnerability in her small frame. "And you've been on your own this whole time?" he asked gently. Mary nodded, her gaze still fixed on the pavement. "I've learned to manage. But I don't know how to find her. I thought maybe someone like you could help." Edward considered her carefully. He was a man of resources and influence, used to solving complex problems in the business world. But this was different. This was personal in a way he hadn't experienced before. "All right," he said, his tone resolute. "I'll help you. I don't know where to start, but I'll figure it out." Mary's head shot up, her wide eyes filled with cautious hope. "You will." "I will," Edward assured her. "But first, let's get you something to eat. Have you eaten today?" She hesitated before shaking her head. "Not yet." Edward gestured toward his car, a sleek black sedan parked nearby. "Come on. We'll talk more over lunch." Mary hesitated, looking between Edward and the car. Trust didn't come easily to her, but something in his voice felt genuine. After a moment, she nodded and followed him. The restaurant Edward chose was upscale, its polished floors and crystal chandeliers a stark contrast to Mary's usual surroundings. She shifted uncomfortably in her chair, feeling out of place, but Edward offered her a kind smile. "Order whatever you want," he said, sliding the menu toward her. Mary glanced at the glossy pages, her eyes scanning the unfamiliar dishes. After some hesitation, she pointed to something simple, a burger and fries. Edward nodded and ordered the same, adding drinks and dessert without a second thought. As they waited for their food, Edward leaned forward. "Mary, do you have anything that belonged to your mom? Something that might help us find her?" Mary reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn locket. She placed it carefully on the table and opened it to reveal a faded photo of a smiling woman with warm eyes. "This is her," Mary said softly. Edward studied the photo, committing the woman's features to memory. "Do you know where she worked or if she had friends who might know where she went?" "She worked a lot of different jobs," Mary explained. "But she mostly talked about this office job she had. She said it was important, but she didn't tell me much more." Edward's mind began to churn. "Do you remember the name of the company?" Mary frowned, thinking hard. "Something with an S. Maybe Sterling, or Stellar. I don't remember exactly." Edward froze. "Sterling Enterprises?" Mary nodded slowly. "I think that was it. Do you know it?" He leaned back in his chair, a knot forming in his stomach. Sterling Enterprises had been one of his companies before he sold it years ago. If her mother had worked there, this search might uncover more than he expected. "Yes," Edward said carefully. "I know it. I'll look into it." Their food arrived, momentarily breaking the tension. Mary ate quickly, clearly ravenous, while Edward's thoughts raced. He couldn't shake the strange coincidence that connected Mary's missing mother to his old company. Something told him this was just the beginning of a much larger story. After they finished eating, Edward paid the bill and rose to his feet. "All right, Mary," he said with determination. "Let's start this journey. Together, we'll find your mother." Mary looked up at him, her face lighting up with hope. For the first time in years, she didn't feel completely alone. Edward drove Mary back to his office, a towering glass building that reflected the city skyline. As they entered the spacious lobby, Mary's eyes widened at the marble floors, the high ceilings, and the rows of busy employees moving with purpose. She stayed close to Edward, feeling small and out of place. "Don't worry," Edward said, noticing her unease. "You're with me." He guided her into the elevator and pressed the button for the top floor. The ride was silent, the hum of the machinery the only sound. When the doors opened, they stepped into Edward's private office, a sleek, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. Mary lingered near the door, unsure if she should sit. Edward gestured toward a plush chair by his desk. "Make yourself comfortable. This might take a little while." She nodded and perched on the edge of the seat. Edward settled behind his desk, typing quickly into his computer. He accessed old records from Sterling Enterprises, scanning through names and files in search of Claire, Mary's mother. Minutes turned into an hour as he dug deeper, his expression growing more serious. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I found something," he said. Mary sat up straighter. "What is it?" Edward turned the screen toward her, showing an employee file. Claire worked for Sterling Enterprises as a secretary. She was employed there for 3 years until she left, abruptly. "Why did she leave?" Mary asked, her voice tinged with worry. "That's the strange part," Edward replied. "The records say she resigned voluntarily, but there's no exit interview, no forwarding address, nothing. It's like she just vanished." Mary frowned, her hands gripping the armrests of the chair. "That doesn't sound right. My mom wouldn't just leave me like that." Edward nodded. "I don't think so either. There's something else. Her final weeks on the job overlapped with an internal investigation we were conducting back then: embezzlement, theft, corporate sabotage. It was a mess. Do you think she was involved?" Mary's voice was barely a whisper. Edward hesitated. "I don't know. But I doubt it. She doesn't fit the profile. Still, it's possible she knew something or got caught in the crossfire." A knock on the door interrupted them. Edward's assistant, Linda, stepped in, carrying a stack of papers. "Mr. Blake, I pulled the additional files you requested from Sterling Enterprises archives." "Thank you, Linda," Edward said. "Leave them here." Linda placed the documents on the desk, her curious gaze flicking to Mary before she left. Edward opened the files and scanned them quickly. One in particular caught his attention, a list of names tied to the investigation. His eyes narrowed as he recognized one of them. "Richard Hale," Edward muttered. "Who's that?" Mary asked. "He was my partner back then," Edward explained, his tone darkening. "We built Sterling Enterprises together, but things soured toward the end. Richard had a talent for bending rules, and breaking them. Do you think he had something to do with my mom disappearing?" Mary's voice was filled with a mix of fear and hope. "It's possible," Edward said. "Richard had a way of dragging people into his schemes, whether they wanted to be involved or not. If your mother knew something, she might have been targeted." Mary swallowed hard, her fingers clutching the edge of the desk. "So what do we do now?" Edward closed the file, his jaw set with determination. "We confront Richard. If anyone knows what happened to your mother, it's him. But this won't be easy. He's not the kind of man who gives answers freely." "Then we'll make him talk," Mary said firmly. Edward looked at her, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "You're braver than most adults I know, Mary. All right. Let's do this. But we'll need a plan." As they prepared for their next step, the air between them shifted. What had started as a chance encounter was evolving into a partnership, bound by a shared determination to uncover the truth. For the first time, Edward felt he was doing something that truly mattered, and Mary felt she wasn't alone in her fight. Edward wasted no time. He called his most trusted investigator, a man named Simon, who had a reputation for being thorough and discreet. Simon arrived at Edward's office within the hour, his demeanor calm and professional, but his sharp eyes immediately assessing Mary and the seriousness of the situation. "This is Simon," Edward said to Mary. "If anyone can help us untangle this, it's him." Simon nodded to Mary, offering a reassuring smile. "I've heard about you. You're quite brave." Mary gave a small, shy smile in return, but her focus remained on the task at hand. "Do you know where Richard Hale is?" she asked, her voice steady. Simon pulled out a tablet and began tapping on it. "He's been keeping a low profile these days, but I can track him. Last I heard, he was managing a private investment firm. But if he's involved in something shady, he won't be operating out in the open." Edward crossed his arms, his tone firm. "We need to find him, Simon. And we need to be prepared. Richard won't talk unless we push him." Simon nodded. "I'll get to work on it immediately." In the meantime, I'd suggest you prepare for resistance. Richard always surrounded himself with, let's say, less than savory characters. After Simon left, Edward turned to Mary. Are you ready for this? Once we confront Richard, things might get intense. Mary's gaze didn't waver. I've been through worse. I just want to find my mom. Her determination fueled Edward's resolve. All right. Let's get ready. The next morning, Simon returned with news. Richard has a private office in the outskirts of the city, tucked away in a building that's deliberately nondescript. It's heavily secured, which tells me he's hiding more than just business dealings. Edward frowned. He always did love his secrets. Do we have a way in? Simon smirked. I have a contact who can get us through the front door. But you'll need to handle Richard yourself. Mary, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. What do we do if he doesn't talk? Simon looked at her, then at Edward. You'll need leverage. Something he wants or fears. Do you have anything like that? Edward thought for a moment. When we parted ways, I held on to a folder of incriminating documents. I didn't think I'd need it, but, let's just say it paints Richard in a very bad light. Simon raised an eyebrow. That'll work. Bring it. Later that evening, Edward and Mary arrived at the building Simon had described. The area was eerily quiet, the kind of place where people minded their own business. Edward held a sleek black folder under his arm, his face set with determination. Mary stayed close to him, her small frame hidden under an oversized hoodie. Simon's contact met them at the entrance, guiding them past the guards with a quick exchange of words and a few subtle handshakes. Inside, the air felt heavy, the fluorescent lighting casting harsh shadows across the narrow hallways. When they reached Richard's office, Edward knocked firmly. The door opened to reveal Richard Hale himself, older than Edward remembered but still exuding the same smug confidence. His sharp suit and calculating eyes hinted at a man who had never left the world of manipulation and deceit behind. Edward, Richard said with a smirk. To what do I owe this surprise? Edward stepped inside, Mary trailing behind him. We need to talk. Richard's gaze flicked to Mary, his smirk fading slightly. And who's this? Your assistant. Edward ignored the jab and placed the black folder on Richard's desk. You'll want to sit down for this. Richard's smile faltered as he opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. This is ancient history, he said, his voice tightening. Why bring it up now? Edward leaned forward, his tone ice-cold. Because I need answers. About Claire. Richard's face hardened. Claire. I haven't heard that name in years. Why would I know anything about her? Mary stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. Because she disappeared. And you're the last person who might know why. For a moment, Richard's expression flickered, something between guilt and anger. I don't know where she is, he said. But I warned her not to get involved in things that didn't concern her. Edward's fist clenched. What did you do to her, Richard? Nothing. Richard snapped, his composure cracking. She found out things she wasn't supposed to. I told her to back off, but she wouldn't listen. I had to make sure she stayed quiet. Mary's voice trembled with anger. You forced her to leave, didn't you? You made her disappear. Richard hesitated, then sighed. She left on her own. But yes, I gave her a push. She had a choice, stay and risk everything, or disappear to protect herself and someone else. Edward's eyes narrowed. Someone else? Who? Richard glanced at Mary, his jaw tightening. I think you already know. The room fell silent as Edward and Mary exchanged a look, the weight of Richard's words settling over them. Edward stepped closer, his voice low but firm. Where did she go, Richard? I don't know exactly, Richard said, his voice laced with frustration. "But I can give you a name. Someone who might." Edward stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "Write it down." As Richard scribbled the name on a piece of paper, Mary's heart raced. For the first time in 2 years, she felt closer to finding her mother. But she also knew this was only the beginning. Richard slid the piece of paper across the desk toward Edward. The name scribbled in sharp, hurried handwriting read, "Victor Cross." Edward picked it up, his jaw tightening as he stared at the name. "Victor Cross," Edward muttered. "Who is he?" Richard leaned back in his chair, a faint smirk creeping onto his face. "A fixer. He cleans up problems, for a price. If Claire vanished, there's a good chance he knows how and why." Mary's fists clenched at her sides. "Why would my mom need someone like him?" Richard raised an eyebrow, his tone dripping with condescension. "Because she didn't just stumble across sensitive information. She became a threat, whether she wanted to or not. Victor would have been hired to make her disappear. How he did it, and where she went, is anyone's guess." Edward slammed his hand down on the desk, the sound echoing through the room. "Why didn't you stop it?" "I didn't hire him," Richard said defensively. "I just know how these things work. If you want answers, talk to Victor." Edward took a deep breath, trying to contain his anger. He glanced at Mary, whose face was a mixture of fear and determination. He pocketed the note and turned back to Richard. "If I find out you're lying or withholding anything, we'll be back. And it won't end with a conversation." Richard's smirk faded as Edward and Mary turned and left the room. The air in the hallway felt heavier than before, tension buzzing between them as they made their way to the car. Back in the car, Mary finally spoke. "Who is this Victor guy? Can we even trust what Richard said?" Edward gripped the steering wheel tightly. "Victor Cross is bad news. I've never dealt with him directly, but I've heard stories. He operates in the shadows, doing whatever it takes to erase problems for his clients. If he's involved, it means someone wanted your mom gone badly enough to pay for it." Mary's voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "So she might still be alive?" Edward softened, glancing at her. If Victor's work was to make her disappear, then yes. She might have gone into hiding. Mary nodded, her hope reignited. "Then we have to find him." Edward sighed, starting the engine. "We will. But we have to be careful. People like Victor don't operate out in the open." The next day, Edward called Simon back to his office. Simon, as always, arrived promptly, his expression neutral but curious. "We need to track down Victor Cross," Edward said, handing Simon the note. "Richard says he's connected to Claire's disappearance." Simon's eyes widened slightly. "Victor Cross. That's a dangerous path to follow. But if that's what it takes, I'll find him." "Do it discreetly," Edward warned. "The last thing we need is to spook him." Simon nodded and left without another word, his efficiency both comforting and unsettling. Meanwhile, Edward and Mary waited in tense silence, the hours dragging on as Simon worked his connections. By evening, Simon called with an update. "I've got a lead. Victor's been seen at a private club downtown. It's exclusive, invitation only, but I can get you in. Just be aware, this place is crawling with powerful people who don't like outsiders." Edward glanced at Mary. "What about her?" Simon hesitated. "It's risky. The club isn't a place for kids. If she stays out of sight, maybe, but it's your call." Mary spoke up before Edward could respond. "I'm going. I've come this far. I'm not staying behind now." Edward nodded, recognizing the determination in her voice. "All right. We'll be careful." The club was a world apart, dimly lit, with velvet walls and a low hum of jazz music filling the air. Men in tailored suits and women in glittering dresses moved through the space, their conversations hushed but intense. Edward and Mary entered through a side door, guided by Simon's contact. "Victor Cross is upstairs," the contact whispered. "Room 214. He'll be expecting someone, but not you." Edward adjusted his tie, his face set. "We'll handle it." "Thanks." They ascended a spiral staircase, the noise from the main floor fading as they reached the upper level. Mary stayed close to Edward, her heart pounding in her chest. When they reached room 214, Edward knocked firmly. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man in his late 40s with sharp features and piercing gray eyes. He was dressed impeccably, his demeanor calm but calculating. "Victor Cross." "You're not who I expected," Victor said, his voice smooth but edged with suspicion. "We need to talk," Edward said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. Mary followed, her small figure almost hidden behind Edward. Victor's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "And who's this?" "She's the reason we're here," Edward said firmly. "You helped someone disappear 2 years ago. Claire. We need to know where she is." Victor closed the door behind them and leaned against it, his arms crossed. "Claire. I remember her. But my services don't come with a tracking feature. Once someone's gone, they're gone." Edward's voice turned cold. "We're not leaving without answers. You either tell us what you know, or I'll make sure your clients find out just how much you can't keep secrets." Victor's eyes narrowed, his calm facade cracking slightly. "You don't scare me, Blake. But, for the kid's sake, I'll tell you this much: Claire didn't disappear because of me. She vanished because she was protecting someone. Someone very important to her." "Who?" Mary demanded, her voice trembling. Victor's gaze locked onto hers, his tone quieter now. "You. She disappeared for you." The weight of his words hung in the air, leaving Mary stunned. Edward stepped closer, his voice firm. "Where is she now?" Victor hesitated, then sighed. "She's alive. And I can get you to her. But it'll cost you." Edward didn't flinch. "Name your price." Victor smirked faintly. "We'll discuss it. But not here. Tomorrow night. Same place." As Edward and Mary left the club, the weight of the revelation pressed heavily on them. Claire was alive, and they were closer than ever to finding her. But the journey was far from over. The next evening arrived with a tension that hung in the air like an unspoken warning. Edward prepared for the meeting with meticulous care, his mind racing with the possibilities of what Victor might demand. Mary stayed close, quieter than usual, her thoughts clearly consumed by what Victor had said the night before. As the time approached, Edward glanced at her. "Are you sure you want to come with me tonight? This could get dangerous." Mary straightened, her voice steady. "I'm not staying behind. If this is about my mom, I need to be there." Edward nodded, respecting her resolve. Together, they left for the club, their silence filled with anticipation and unspoken fears. The club was just as they had left it, opulent and shadowy, a haven for secrets. Edward and Mary were guided back to the same room, where Victor Cross awaited them. He sat in a leather chair, a glass of dark liquor in his hand, his expression unreadable. "You're punctual," Victor said, gesturing for them to sit. "I like that." Edward ignored the pleasantries, his tone sharp. "What do you want, Victor? What's your price?" Victor took a slow sip of his drink before setting it down. Straight to the point. "I respect that. Here's the deal, I have the information you want. But getting it meant calling in favors, digging into old networks. That doesn't come cheap." Edward crossed his arms, his patience wearing thin. "How much?" Victor smirked faintly. "Not money, Edward. I have plenty of that. I need leverage. A favor. One that only someone like you can provide. Edward's jaw tightened. What kind of favor? Victor leaned forward, his eyes sharp. There's a man, a rival of mine, who's been causing problems. I need him neutralized. His operation dismantled. You have the connections and the means to do it. You take him out of the picture, and I'll give you everything you need to find Claire. Edward stared at him, his anger barely contained. You want me to do your dirty work? Victor shrugged. Call it what you want. I'm offering you a trade. And let's not pretend you haven't done worse to protect your own interests in the past. Mary, who had been silent until now, spoke up, her voice filled with quiet fury. You're using my mom's life as a bargaining chip. Victor's expression softened slightly as he looked at her. I'm giving you a chance to save her. That's more than most people in this business would do. Edward stood abruptly, his hands clenched into fists. Give me his name. Victor handed him a card with a single name and address written on it. He operates out of a warehouse on the east side. Handle it, and Claire's location will be yours. Edward pocketed the card without another word, then gestured for Mary to follow him. As they walked back to the car, Mary turned to him, her eyes searching his face. Are you really going to do this? She asked. Edward sighed, running a hand through his hair. I don't see another way, Mary. If Victor's telling the truth, this is the fastest way to find your mom. Mary looked down, her fists clenched at her sides. I hate this. I hate that we have to play by his rules. Edward knelt in front of her, placing a hand on her shoulder. I know. But we're going to find her. No matter what it takes. The next day, Edward put his plan into motion. Using his contacts, he gathered information on Victor's rival, a man named Caleb Grant, who ran a smuggling ring out of the warehouse. Caleb was ruthless, but his operation was vulnerable, built on shaky alliances and bribed officials. Edward didn't plan to confront Caleb alone. He enlisted Simon, whose resourcefulness and discretion would be invaluable. Together, they formulated a strategy to expose Caleb's illegal activities and dismantle his network without resorting to violence. Under the cover of night, Edward and Simon infiltrated the warehouse. The air was thick with the smell of oil and damp concrete, the faint hum of machinery echoing through the cavernous space. They moved carefully, avoiding the guards as they planted recording devices and gathered evidence of the operation. Mary waited anxiously in the car, her hands gripping the seat. She had wanted to go with them, but Edward had insisted she stay behind, promising her it was too dangerous. Every passing minute felt like an hour as she stared at the warehouse, her heart pounding. Inside, Edward and Simon found what they needed, a cache of stolen goods, incriminating documents, and even recordings of Caleb's deals. With the evidence secured, they slipped out unnoticed, leaving behind a trail that would lead authorities straight to Caleb's door. Back at the car, Edward and Simon climbed in, both looking tired but triumphant. Mary's eyes lit up as she saw them. Did you get it? She asked. Edward nodded, a small smile breaking through his exhaustion. We did. Caleb's operation will be shut down by morning. Mary exhaled in relief. So now, Victor has to keep his word. Edward's smile faded slightly as he started the car. Yes. And if he doesn't, we'll make him. The drive back to Victor's club was silent, the tension building with each passing mile. Edward and Mary knew they were stepping into dangerous territory, but they also knew they were closer than ever to finding Claire. And neither of them was willing to turn back now. Edward and Mary returned to the club the following evening, their resolve unshaken despite the risks. The atmosphere felt heavier this time, as if the walls themselves carried the weight of unspoken deals and dangerous secrets. Edward's expression was unreadable, but Mary could see the tension in his jaw and the tight grip of his hands as they ascended the spiral staircase. When they reached Victor's room, Edward knocked once, firmly. The door swung open, and Victor greeted them with his usual calm demeanor. "Ah, Edward," Victor said smoothly, stepping aside to let them in. "And Mary. I take it your little errand was successful?" Edward walked past him, setting a USB drive on Victor's desk. "It's done. Everything you need to take down Caleb is on that drive. Now hold up your end of the deal." Victor picked up the drive, examining it with an amused smirk. "Efficient as always. I'll admit, I wasn't sure you had it in you anymore, Edward." "Enough," Edward snapped. "Where is Claire?" Victor's smirk faded, replaced by a more serious expression. He moved to a locked cabinet and retrieved a slim folder, handing it to Edward. "Her location, as promised. But be warned, getting to her won't be simple." Edward opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents inside. It included an address in a remote area, along with notes suggesting Claire had been under surveillance. He frowned, noticing mentions of a group that seemed to be protecting her. "She's in hiding," Victor explained. "Not from me, but from the people who wanted her silenced. If you go there, you'll need to tread carefully." Mary's voice trembled as she stepped forward. "Why is she hiding? What did she do that made her a target?" Victor's gaze softened slightly as he looked at her. "She didn't do anything wrong. She stumbled onto something big, something that could have destroyed powerful people. Her only mistake was not walking away when she had the chance." Edward closed the folder, his face set with determination. "We'll handle it." Victor leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning. "I'm sure you will. Good luck, Edward. You're going to need it." As they left the club, Edward and Mary climbed into the car, the folder resting on Edward's lap. The air between them was heavy with anticipation and uncertainty. "Where is she?" Mary asked softly. Edward pointed to the address. "A safe house in the countryside. It's isolated, which means whoever's protecting her didn't want her found. Do you think she'll be happy to see us?" Mary's voice was hesitant, a flicker of doubt in her usually determined tone. Edward glanced at her, his expression softening. "Mary, she's your mom. No matter what's happened, she'll want to see you. We just have to get to her first." Mary nodded, her hope outweighing her fears. "Then let's go." The drive to the countryside took several hours. The city lights faded into the distance, replaced by rolling hills and dense forests. The isolation of the area became more apparent as they approached the address. The roads were narrow and winding, lined with towering trees that seemed to close in around them. When they finally arrived, the safe house came into view. It was a modest cabin, its wooden exterior blending into the natural surroundings. Edward parked the car a short distance away, turning off the engine. "Stay close," he said to Mary, his voice low but firm. "We don't know who's inside." They approached the cabin cautiously, the crunch of gravel under their feet the only sound in the still night. Edward knocked on the door, the sound echoing in the quiet. For a moment, there was no response, and Mary's heart sank. Then, the door creaked open, revealing a woman with weary eyes and disheveled hair. Her face was thinner than the photo Mary carried, but there was no mistaking her. It was Claire. Mary froze, her voice caught in her throat. "Mom." Claire's eyes widened, her hand flying to her mouth as tears welled up. "Mary," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Is it really you?" Mary nodded, and before she could say another word, Claire pulled her into a tight embrace, sobbing openly. Edward stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes betrayed the emotion he felt watching the reunion. "I thought I'd never see you again," Claire murmured, her hands gently cradling Mary's face. "I've missed you so much." Mary clung to her, her own tears falling freely. "I've been looking for you, Mom. I never gave up." Edward cleared his throat gently, and Claire's gaze shifted to him. Her expression turned to one of cautious recognition. "Edward?" He nodded. It's been a long time, Claire. Claire's face hardened slightly, but her grip on Mary didn't falter. Why are you here? How did you find us? Mary stepped in, her voice steady despite her tears. He helped me. We found out everything, about Sterling Enterprises, about why you disappeared. We had to find you. Claire's shoulders slumped, her exhaustion visible. It's not safe here. They'll come back if they know you're here. Edward's voice was firm. Then we'll make sure they don't. You're not alone anymore, Claire. The words hung in the air, the weight of years of separation and danger finally giving way to a fragile but undeniable sense of hope. Claire closed the door behind them, locking it with swift, practiced movements. Her hands trembled as she secured the latch, a testament to the fear she had lived with for so long. The cabin was modest, with simple furniture and sparse decorations, but it radiated a sense of quiet resilience. A small fire crackled in the hearth, casting flickering shadows across the room. Mary clung to Claire's side, unwilling to let go, as Edward stood a few steps away, his presence both steady and cautious. Claire gestured for them to sit at the worn wooden table in the center of the room. I don't know how you found me, Claire began, her voice low and strained, but you shouldn't have come. It's too dangerous. Mary's voice broke through the tension, filled with a mix of frustration and longing. Mom, I had to find you. I didn't care how dangerous it was. I couldn't live not knowing if you were okay. Claire's face softened, tears welling in her eyes again. She reached across the table to hold Mary's hand. I've thought about you every single day. Leaving you was the hardest thing I've ever done, but I didn't have a choice. Edward, his arms crossed, leaned slightly forward. Claire, you don't have to run anymore. We can protect you. But I need to understand what happened. Claire hesitated, her eyes flicking between Edward and Mary. Finally, she took a deep breath, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of her story was finally too much to carry alone. It started at Sterling Enterprises, she said, her voice trembling but steady. I was just a secretary, filing papers and answering phones. But one day, I stumbled on something I shouldn't have, records of illegal transactions, money laundering, and bribes. It was everywhere, hidden in plain sight. Mary's grip on Claire's hand tightened. Did Richard Hale know? Claire nodded. He was at the center of it. When I tried to report it, I realized how deep it went. People were being paid off, silenced. I became a target. They threatened me, Mary. They said if I didn't stay quiet, they'd come after you. Edward's face darkened, his jaw tightening. And Victor Cross. How does he fit into this? Victor wasn't part of it at first, Claire explained. But when I refused to back down, Richard hired him to make me disappear. Victor gave me an ultimatum, vanish or put Mary in danger. I didn't trust him, but I knew staying wasn't an option. So, I ran. Mary's voice trembled with a mix of anger and sadness. You could have told me. You didn't have to leave me alone. Claire's tears fell freely now. I thought I was protecting you. I didn't know how else to keep you safe. Edward stepped in, his voice firm but not unkind. And the people watching you now? Are they Victor's men? Claire shook her head. No. After I ran, I found someone who helped me disappear, people who understood what I was up against. They've been protecting me, but it's been a constant fight to stay one step ahead. Edward nodded slowly, his mind already working through the information. We need to get you out of here. If Richard's still pulling strings, this place isn't safe anymore. Claire frowned. And go where? If they find me again. They won't, Edward interrupted. I've spent years cleaning up Richard's messes. I know how he operates, and I know how to stop him. But I need your help. We need to expose him, Claire. Publicly. Claire's face went pale. You don't understand. If we do that, the people behind Richard, the ones funding him, they'll come after all of us. Edward met her gaze, his voice steady. Let them try. This ends now. Mary's voice broke through the tension, filled with quiet determination. We're not running anymore, Mom. We're going to face this together. For the first time in years, Claire allowed herself a flicker of hope. She looked at Mary, then at Edward, and nodded. All right. But if we're going to do this, we need to move quickly. Edward stood, already reaching for his phone to contact Simon. Pack whatever you need. We leave tonight. As Claire hurried to gather her belongings, Mary stayed by her side, her grip on her mother's hand never faltering. Edward moved with purpose, his phone pressed to his ear as he issued instructions to Simon. By the time they stepped out of the cabin and into the cold night air, the wheels were already in motion. The road ahead would be treacherous, but for the first time, they weren't facing it alone. Together, they were ready to fight back. The dark road stretched ahead, winding through dense woods that seemed to close in around the car as Edward drove. Claire sat in the passenger seat, her eyes darting nervously to the rearview mirror, while Mary was in the back, clutching the locket she had carried since Claire's disappearance. The weight of the past years hung heavily in the silence, broken only by the hum of the engine. Edward glanced at Claire, his voice low but firm. Simon is meeting us in the city. He'll have a safe location ready for us until we can figure out the next step. Claire nodded, but her grip on the door tightened. I just hope we're not leading them straight to him. Richard's people, they're relentless. Edward's voice hardened. They'll try, but we'll be ready. Mary leaned forward, her voice cutting through the tension. What happens after? How do we stop Richard? Edward glanced at her through the mirror. We take the evidence Claire found and everything I've collected over the years. We expose him publicly, make sure there's no place for him to hide. Claire hesitated. If we do that, we're not just going after Richard. The people funding him won't go down quietly. Good, Edward said. It's time they learn what it feels like to be exposed. Before Claire could respond, the headlights of another car appeared in the rearview mirror, closing in quickly. Her body stiffened, and Edward noticed immediately. Is that them? She asked, her voice shaking. Edward didn't answer right away, his focus on the road. The car behind them sped up, its headlights glaring. Hold on, he said, his tone sharp. He pressed down on the gas, the engine roaring as the car surged forward. The vehicle behind them matched their speed, edging closer. Mary's heart raced as she gripped the back of Edward's seat. Mom, what's happening? She asked, panic creeping into her voice. It's them, Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. They found us. Edward swerved onto a narrower road, his jaw tight. Keep your heads down. I'll handle this. The car behind them accelerated, its engine a low growl as it drew closer. Suddenly, the other driver turned on high beams, flooding Edward's rearview mirror with blinding light. Edward cursed under his breath, maneuvering the car around a sharp curve. We're not going to outrun them, Claire said, gripping the dashboard. They'll force us off the road. Edward's eyes darted around, searching for an opening. We won't outrun them, but we don't have to. Hold on. Spotting a side road, Edward made a sharp turn, the tires screeching as the car skidded onto the gravel path. The pursuing vehicle overshot the turn, momentarily disappearing from view. Edward took the opportunity to weave through the trees, the car's headlights barely illuminating the narrow trail. Mary clutched the locket to her chest, her breathing shallow. Are they gone? Edward shook his head. Not yet. They'll be back. Just as he spoke, the headlights reappeared, the other car tearing down the side road with reckless speed. Edward slammed on the brakes, spinning the car to face a different direction. The sudden move bought them a few precious seconds, but the other car quickly corrected its course. They're not giving up, Claire said, fear lacing her voice. Edward's jaw tightened. Neither am I. The road ahead opened into a clearing with a shallow stream cutting through it. Edward didn't hesitate. He gunned the engine, sending the car splashing through the water. The tires fought for traction as they climbed the opposite bank, mud spraying behind them. The pursuing car slowed, struggling to cross the stream. Edward took the opportunity to put more distance between them, maneuvering back onto a paved road. Finally, the pursuing car's headlights disappeared completely, swallowed by the darkness. "We lost them," Edward said, his voice steady despite the tension in his shoulders. Claire exhaled shakily, her hands still gripping the dashboard. "For now." Mary leaned back, her fingers loosening around the locket. "That was close." Edward glanced at her in the mirror, his expression softening. "You okay?" Mary nodded, though her face was pale. "Yeah. I'm fine." The rest of the drive passed in tense silence, the weight of the encounter pressing heavily on all of them. When they finally reached the city, Simon was waiting in an unmarked SUV near a quiet alley. He approached their car as they pulled in, his sharp eyes immediately assessing the situation. "Trouble?" Simon asked, his tone calm but alert. "Richard's men," Edward said as he got out of the car. "We shook them off, but they're close." Simon nodded, motioning for Claire and Mary to follow him. "We'll move fast. The safe house is nearby, and it's secure. Let's go." They transferred to Simon's SUV, its tinted windows providing a layer of anonymity. As they drove through the quiet streets, Mary leaned against Claire, her exhaustion finally catching up to her. Claire wrapped an arm around her, holding her close. Edward sat in the front seat, his gaze fixed ahead. "This isn't over," he said quietly to Simon. "Not until Richard and everyone backing him are finished." Simon glanced at him, his expression unreadable. "Then we'd better get to work." The safe house was located on the outskirts of the city, tucked behind a row of abandoned warehouses. It was an unassuming building, its plain brick exterior giving no hint of the secure haven inside. Simon parked the SUV in a hidden garage, motioning for Edward, Claire, and Mary to follow him through a side entrance. Inside, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The space was clean and organized, with a living area furnished with comfortable but utilitarian pieces. A large table was covered with maps, documents, and a few pieces of equipment that hinted at Simon's preparation for scenarios exactly like this one. Mary sat down heavily on the couch, the adrenaline from their escape finally giving way to exhaustion. Claire hovered nearby, her protective instincts on high alert despite her fatigue. Edward and Simon moved to the table, their voices low as they began to strategize. "Richard's men are close," Edward said, his tone grim. "We shook them for now, but they'll come looking." Simon nodded. "I've already set up a perimeter alert system. If anyone comes within a mile of this place, we'll know." "And the evidence?" Edward asked. "We have to get it ready to go public." Simon handed him a USB drive. "I compiled everything you and Claire provided. Financial records, transaction logs, names, everything. But we need to coordinate the release carefully. If we go too soon, Richard will spin it before it gains traction." Edward frowned, his frustration clear. "The longer we wait, the more time he has to retaliate." "We'll time it right," Simon assured him. "I've got contacts in the press and whistleblower groups. When we move, it'll hit hard and fast." As they talked, Claire approached, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What happens to us after this? If we expose Richard, won't that make us even bigger targets?" Edward turned to her, his expression softening. "You'll be protected. Simon and I will make sure of it." Claire shook her head. "I don't want protection. I want this to end. For Mary's sake." Mary, who had been quietly listening, stood up. "Mom, we're already in this. We can't stop now. Claire sighed, pulling Mary into a gentle hug. I just want you to be safe. Edward stepped closer, his voice firm but kind. Claire, we're going to make sure of that. But we need your help. Your testimony, your voice, it'll make all the difference. Claire hesitated, the weight of his words settling over her. Finally, she nodded. All right. But if we're doing this, we do it together. Simon's phone buzzed, breaking the moment. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. We've got movement near the perimeter. 2 vehicles. No plates. Edward's expression hardened. Richard's men. Simon grabbed a small tablet connected to security cameras placed around the safe house. The screen showed grainy footage of 2 black SUVs approaching from the north, their headlights off as they crept closer. We don't have much time, Simon said, his voice calm but urgent. Get Claire and Mary into the panic room. It's secure, and they'll be safe there. Claire grabbed Mary's hand, her eyes wide with fear. What about you? Edward glanced at her, his resolve unshaken. We'll deal with them. Mary stepped forward, her voice trembling. I don't want to leave you. Edward knelt in front of her, placing his hands on her shoulders. Mary, I need you to trust me. I won't let anything happen to you or your mom. But you have to stay safe. Mary's lip quivered, but she nodded reluctantly. Claire led her toward the back of the safe house, where Simon opened a concealed door leading to a reinforced room. He locked it behind them, giving Claire a brief nod. Stay quiet, he said. We'll come for you when it's over. Edward and Simon moved quickly, preparing for the confrontation. Simon handed Edward a small earpiece and a weapon, his movements efficient and practiced. Plan? Edward asked, his voice low. We hold them off, Simon replied. If they breach, we fall back to the panic room and call for extraction. The sound of car doors slamming outside signaled the arrival of Richard's men. Through the cameras, Edward and Simon watched as a group of armed individuals spread out, scanning the area. Edward's grip on the weapon tightened. Let's make this quick. The first intruder approached the main entrance, testing the lock. Simon triggered a silent alarm, causing the intruder to pause. Edward moved to a side window, catching a glimpse of another man circling the perimeter. 2 by the east side, Edward whispered into the earpiece. Copy, Simon replied, positioning himself near the entrance. The tension in the air was palpable as the intruders began their assault. A loud crash echoed through the safe house as one of the men attempted to break down the front door. Edward and Simon exchanged a brief look before moving into position. The battle was swift but intense. Simon's traps and defenses slowed the intruders, giving Edward the advantage he needed to disable 2 of them. The remaining men retreated under the cover of darkness, their mission a failure. As the dust settled, Edward and Simon secured the area, ensuring the threat was gone. Simon unlocked the panic room, revealing Claire and Mary huddled together. Relief washed over Claire's face as she saw them unharmed. It's over, Edward said, his voice steady. For now. Mary rushed to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. You're okay. Edward hugged her tightly, his resolve stronger than ever. We all are. But deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. The fight against Richard and the forces behind him was far from over. The aftermath of the attack left the safe house tense and quiet. Simon worked methodically to patch up the damage while Edward stood near the window, his eyes scanning the darkened landscape for any sign of movement. Claire and Mary sat on the couch, still shaken but grateful for their safety. Mary broke the silence, her voice small but steady. Do you think they'll come back? Edward turned to her, his expression serious. Not tonight. We sent a message. But Richard won't stop until we make him. Simon approached, wiping his hands on a cloth. The perimeter's secure for now. We should move as soon as possible. This place is compromised. Claire frowned, her arms crossed tightly. Where can we go? If they found us here, they'll find us again. Edward nodded. We need to stay ahead of them. Simon, is the backup location ready? Simon pulled up his tablet, scrolling through a secure file. There's a place in the mountains. Remote, well fortified, and off the grid. It'll buy us time to finalize the plan. Claire glanced at Mary, worry etched into her features. This isn't a life for her. Running, hiding, it's too much. Mary shook her head, her voice resolute. I'm not leaving you, Mom. We're doing this together. Edward's gaze softened as he looked at Mary. She's stronger than you think, Claire. And she has us. Claire exhaled, nodding reluctantly. Then let's go. The journey to the mountain safe house was long and arduous. The SUV wound through narrow roads flanked by dense forests, the world outside growing quieter with every mile. Simon drove with precision, while Edward kept a watchful eye on the road behind them. Claire and Mary sat close, the bond between them growing stronger despite the danger. When they finally arrived, the safe house emerged from the shadows, a sturdy cabin nestled against a rocky hillside, its design blending seamlessly with the surrounding wilderness. Solar panels lined the roof, and a satellite dish was discreetly placed near the rear. It was clear this location had been prepared with care and foresight. Simon parked the SUV and gestured for everyone to follow him inside. This place is as secure as it gets. There's a panic room in the basement and an encrypted communication system. If they find us here, we'll see them coming long before they reach us. The interior of the cabin was surprisingly spacious, with a large living area, a fully stocked kitchen, and bedrooms tucked away down a hallway. Edward walked through the space, inspecting the security measures while Claire helped Mary settle into one of the rooms. Mary sat on the bed, clutching the locket around her neck. Mom, do you think it's almost over? Will we finally be safe? Claire knelt beside her, brushing a strand of hair from Mary's face. I don't know, sweetheart. But I promise we'll fight for it. Together. Later that evening, the group gathered in the living room. Simon spread out a map on the coffee table, marking key locations and routes. We're almost ready to release the evidence, Simon said, his tone businesslike. But we need to coordinate carefully. The goal is to hit Richard and his backers all at once. That means timing is everything. Edward nodded. Do we have enough to ensure they can't bury this? Simon gestured to a separate stack of documents. More than enough. But we'll need Claire to corroborate it publicly. Her testimony will be the nail in the coffin. Claire's face paled slightly, but she nodded. I'll do it. Whatever it takes to protect Mary. Edward's phone buzzed, breaking the focus of the room. He glanced at the screen, his face darkening. It's from one of my sources. Richard knows we have the evidence. He's mobilizing his people. Simon frowned. Then we're out of time. We have to act now. Mary looked up, her eyes wide. What does that mean? It means we go on the offensive, Edward said firmly. We take the fight to them. Simon leaned forward, his voice calm but intense. If we hit Richard hard enough, we can force him to retreat. That'll give us the window we need to release everything. Claire hesitated, her gaze flicking between Edward and Simon. And if it doesn't work? Edward's voice softened, but his resolve didn't waver. It will. The following morning, the group began preparing for the next phase. Simon coordinated with Edward's contacts to finalize the dissemination of the evidence, while Edward strategized their approach against Richard's network. Claire worked with Simon to rehearse her testimony, her nerves clear but her determination unwavering. Mary watched quietly from the corner, her mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. When Edward took a break, she approached him, her voice hesitant. Do you really think we can win, she asked. Edward knelt to her level, his expression steady. I do. Because we're not just fighting for justice. We're fighting for family. And that's worth everything. Mary nodded, the weight of his words giving her strength. As the sun set over the mountains, the group stood together, ready to face whatever came next. They knew the battle ahead would be their toughest yet, but they also knew they were no longer fighting alone. The early morning air in the mountains was crisp and still, a deceptive calm before the storm. Inside the safe house, the atmosphere was charged with quiet determination. Edward, Simon, Claire, and Mary gathered around the large table in the living room, the map spread out before them. The plan was finalized, and the clock was ticking. Simon spoke first, his voice steady and precise. The evidence will be released through multiple channels, journalists, whistleblower platforms, and social media. Once it's out, there's no taking it back. Richard and his network will have nowhere to hide. Edward nodded, his focus unshaken. And while the evidence spreads, we'll confront Richard directly. If he's busy scrambling to protect himself, he won't have time to retaliate. Claire frowned, her hands resting on the edge of the table. Confront him how? Won't that just put us in more danger? Edward's gaze softened as he looked at her. It's a risk, but we need to cut off his ability to strike back. If we neutralize his key players and disrupt his resources, it'll weaken him enough for law enforcement to step in. Simon pointed to the map. Richard's main operation is here, a high-security compound outside the city. He'll have his inner circle with him, which means it won't be easy to get close. But if we time it right, we can catch them off guard. Mary, sitting quietly next to Claire, finally spoke up. What do you need me and Mom to do? Edward crouched down to meet her eyes. You and your mom will stay here, safe. That's the most important thing. Mary's brow furrowed, her voice firm. But we can help. We've come this far. Claire placed a hand on Mary's shoulder, her voice soft but resolute. Edward's right. This part is too dangerous. We'll stay and make sure the testimony and evidence are ready to go. Mary looked torn but eventually nodded, trusting Edward and Claire's judgment. Edward straightened, exchanging a look with Simon. We leave in an hour. Edward and Simon geared up, their movements methodical as they prepared for what lay ahead. Simon checked the weapons and communication devices, ensuring everything was in working order. Edward double-checked the files they needed to confront Richard, his mind racing with possible outcomes. Before they left, Edward approached Claire and Mary in the kitchen. Mary hugged him tightly, her small frame trembling slightly. Be careful, she whispered. I will, Edward promised, pulling back to look at her. We'll finish this. I promise. Claire stepped forward, her expression a mix of worry and gratitude. Thank you, Edward. For everything. Edward gave her a small nod, his voice steady. I'll bring this to an end. For both of you. The drive to Richard's compound was tense, the landscape changing from open countryside to industrial outskirts. The compound loomed ahead, surrounded by high walls and patrolled by armed guards. Simon parked the car a safe distance away, using binoculars to survey the area. Looks like he's tightened security, Simon said, his tone grim. They're expecting something. Edward frowned. Then we give them something they won't expect. Simon handed him a small earpiece. Stay in contact. I'll monitor from the perimeter and cover your exit. Edward nodded, adjusting his gear before stepping out of the car. He approached the compound cautiously, sticking to the shadows as he made his way to the main gate. Simon's voice crackled in his ear. 2 guards at the entrance. You'll need a distraction. Edward spotted a stack of crates nearby and threw a rock, the clattering noise drawing the guards' attention. As they moved to investigate, he slipped through the gate, his movements silent and deliberate. Inside, the compound was a maze of warehouses and offices. Edward navigated the area, avoiding patrols as he headed for the main building. Simon's updates kept him informed of the guards' positions, allowing him to stay one step ahead. Finally, he reached the central office, where Richard was likely holed up. Edward paused outside the door, taking a deep breath before pushing it open. Inside, Richard sat at a large desk, flanked by two armed men. His expression shifted from surprise to amusement as he saw Edward. "Well, Richard said, leaning back in his chair. "I wasn't expecting a personal visit." Edward stepped inside, his voice cold. "This ends now, Richard." Richard chuckled, gesturing to his guards. "Does it? You're outnumbered, Edward. And this is my turf. What makes you think you'll leave here alive?" Edward held up a small device, its blinking light catching Richard's attention. "Because I've already won. This is connected to every piece of evidence we have on you. Your accounts, your deals, everything. One push, and it's public." Richard's smug expression faltered, replaced by a flicker of fear. "You're bluffing." Edward stepped closer, his voice low and deadly. "Try me." For a moment, the room was silent, the tension thick. Then, Richard's guards stepped back, their hesitation clear. Richard's gaze darted between Edward and the device, his confidence unraveling. "What do you want?" Richard finally asked, his voice tight. "Turn yourself in," Edward said. "Take the fall. If you don't, I'll make sure everyone involved goes down with you." Richard clenched his fists, his composure slipping. "You think you've won, but you have no idea who you're dealing with." Edward leaned in, his eyes narrowing. "And neither do they. If you try to come after me or my family again, I'll make sure they learn everything about you." The threat hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Finally, Richard slumped back in his chair, defeated. Edward stepped back, his grip on the device steady. "I'll be watching," Edward said before turning and leaving the room, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. Outside, Simon was waiting near the car. "How'd it go?" Edward climbed in, exhaling deeply. "He knows he's done. Now we wait for the evidence to do its job." As they drove away, Edward felt a weight lifting from his shoulders. The fight wasn't over yet, but for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. The drive back to the mountain-safe house was tense, despite the victory at Richard's compound. Edward and Simon were silent, their minds racing with thoughts of what might come next. The device in Edward's pocket held the potential to dismantle Richard's empire, but they both knew it was a dangerous game. When they reached the safe house, the first thing Edward saw was Mary rushing out the door. She ran straight to him, her arms wrapping tightly around his waist. "You're back," she said, relief flooding her voice. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice soft. "We're back." And it went as planned. Claire appeared behind Mary, her expression a mix of concern and hope. "What happened? Did he surrender?" Edward nodded, stepping inside and closing the door behind him. "Richard knows the evidence is ready to go public. He's cornered, but we can't assume he'll go quietly. We still need to act fast." Simon placed his bag on the table, pulling out his laptop. "I'll start distributing the files now. Once they're out, we'll need to monitor the fallout and adjust accordingly." Claire sat down, her hands folded tightly on the table. "And what about us? If Richard lashes out?" "We'll be ready," Edward interrupted gently. "But right now, our focus is making sure the world sees who he really is." Mary sat next to Claire, her gaze flicking between Edward and Simon. "What happens after? When it's all out there?" Edward crouched down to meet her eyes. "When it's out, Richard won't have the power to hurt anyone anymore. And you and your mom can finally stop running." Mary's expression softened, a flicker of hope crossing her face. "You really think it's almost over?" Edward nodded. "I do. As Simon worked to distribute the files, the safe house buzzed with quiet activity. Edward double-checked the security measures, while Claire prepared food, her hands shaking slightly as she moved around the kitchen. Mary helped her, their bond growing stronger with every shared task. Hours later, Simon leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. It's done. The files are live on multiple platforms, and I've sent them to trusted journalists. The first reports should start hitting in the next few hours. Edward joined him at the table, his eyes scanning the screen. What about Richard's people? Any signs of retaliation? Simon shook his head. Not yet. But they'll move soon. We need to stay vigilant. Claire approached, her voice hesitant. Do you think this will really stop him? It'll stop him, Edward said firmly. And the people behind him. They'll have no choice but to scatter once this hits. Simon glanced at the screen, where notifications were already lighting up with inquiries from reporters and organizations. It's starting. We should brace ourselves. As the night wore on, the first wave of news reports broke. Headlines exposed Richard's crimes, money laundering, fraud, corruption, and ties to dangerous individuals. Videos and documents circulated widely, leaving no room for denial. Social media exploded with outrage, and public pressure mounted for immediate action. Edward stood by the window, watching the horizon as the first hints of dawn painted the sky. Claire joined him, her voice quiet. It's happening, isn't it? After all this time, people are finally seeing the truth. He nodded, his expression unreadable. It is. But this isn't the end. Richard won't go down without a fight. As if on cue, Simon's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, his expression darkening as he read the message. Richard's men are moving. They're heading for his compound. Edward frowned. Why? The evidence is already out. Simon tapped the screen, pulling up a live feed from one of his contacts. The video showed a convoy of vehicles surrounding Richard's compound, armed men moving with purpose. They're not protecting him, Simon said, his tone grim. They're turning on him. The people backing Richard must think he's too much of a liability now. Claire's hand flew to her mouth. What does that mean? Are they going to kill him? Edward's face hardened. They'll tie up loose ends. Richard's become a threat to them. Mary, who had been listening quietly, stepped closer. What do we do? Edward looked at Simon, then back at Mary. We wait. This isn't our fight anymore. Our job is to stay safe and make sure the truth stays out there. Hours later, reports confirmed what Edward and Simon had suspected. Richard's compound had been raided, not by law enforcement, but by his own allies. He was taken into custody by his own people, likely to be silenced before he could implicate them further. Edward turned off the news feed, his expression grim but resolute. It's over for him. But the people behind this, they're still out there. Simon nodded. We've shaken them, but they'll regroup. They always do. Claire stepped forward, her voice firm. Then we stay ready. We've come this far. We're not backing down now. Mary's voice joined hers, filled with quiet determination. We're not afraid anymore. Edward looked at them, pride and resolve mixing in his gaze. Then we keep fighting. Together. And for the first time, they felt the power of hope stronger than the fear that had chased them for so long. As the sun climbed higher over the mountains, the safe house felt both quieter and more charged with anticipation. The first stage of their mission was complete. Richard's empire was crumbling under the weight of the evidence Edward and Claire had released. But the lingering unease in the air reminded everyone that the battle wasn't fully won. Edward, standing by the kitchen counter with a mug of coffee, was lost in thought as he scanned his phone for updates. News outlets were still flooded with reports, interviews, and public outrage over the revelations. Authorities had launched official investigations, but there was no word on Richard's fate after his capture by his own people. Simon walked in, a tablet in hand, breaking Edward's reverie. "We've got movement," he said, his tone clipped. "Some of Richard's remaining assets are being transferred. Offshore accounts, private holdings. They're trying to salvage what they can." Edward set his coffee down, his expression hardening. "Can we stop it?" Simon nodded. "I've already flagged the accounts with whistleblower groups and authorities. It's just a matter of time before they're frozen. But there's another issue." Edward frowned. "What is it?" Simon hesitated before replying. "Some chatter suggests they know about Claire. Not just her testimony, her location." Edward's jaw tightened. "They're coming for her." Simon's silence was all the confirmation he needed. In the living room, Mary and Claire sat on the couch, going through a stack of old photos Claire had kept hidden during her years in hiding. It was the first time Mary had seen tangible pieces of her childhood since her mother disappeared. Each picture brought a mixture of joy and sadness, the weight of lost time pressing on both of them. "Look at this one," Claire said softly, holding up a photo of Mary as a toddler, laughing as Claire held her in her arms. "You were always so full of energy. You'd run around the park until you couldn't stand anymore." Mary smiled, though her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I don't remember that. I wish I did." Claire cupped Mary's face gently. "We'll make new memories. I promise." Before they could continue, Edward and Simon entered the room, their expressions serious. Claire sat up straighter, immediately sensing the shift in tone. "What's wrong?" Claire asked. Edward glanced at Simon, then back at Claire and Mary. "We think they've found us. Richard's people. They know you're here." Mary's face paled, her grip on Claire's hand tightening. "How?" "We've been so careful." Simon explained, "They've been following the leaks, tracking anything that could lead to you. It's not confirmed yet, but we can't take any chances." Claire stood, her voice firm despite the fear in her eyes. "Then we need to leave." Edward shook his head. "Not yet. The safe house is fortified, and we still have control of the situation. If we run now, we'll lose the advantage." Claire hesitated. "What if they break through? What happens to Mary?" Edward stepped closer, his gaze steady. "They won't get to her. Or to you. We've come too far to let that happen." Mary looked up at him, her voice trembling. "What do we do?" Simon spoke up. "We prepare. If they come, we make sure they don't leave. I've already reinforced the perimeter and set up additional surveillance. If anyone approaches, we'll know." The hours that followed were filled with tense preparation. Simon double-checked the security measures, while Edward worked to secure the remaining evidence and communications. Claire and Mary stayed close, their quiet moments filled with whispered reassurances and determined resolve. As night fell, the safe house was plunged into an uneasy silence. Simon monitored the surveillance feeds, his eyes flicking between the screens. Edward sat nearby, his weapon within arm's reach, his focus unyielding. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. A faint blip on the perimeter sensors caught Simon's attention. "We've got movement," he said, his voice calm but sharp. Edward moved to his side, watching as the cameras showed shadowy figures approaching through the trees. There were at least 6 of them, their movements coordinated and deliberate. "They're here," Edward said grimly. Claire and Mary appeared in the doorway, their faces pale but resolute. Edward turned to them, his voice steady. "Get to the panic room. Stay there until we tell you it's safe." Claire hesitated, her eyes locking with Edward's. "You'll be careful." "I promise," Edward said. "Now go." Claire pulled Mary close, guiding her toward the hidden door that led to the reinforced panic room. Mary looked back once, her eyes filled with fear and determination, before disappearing inside. The first clash came quickly. The intruders attempted to breach the front door, but Simon's defenses slowed them down. A series of traps, flashbangs and smoke, disoriented the attackers, giving Edward and Simon the advantage. Edward took position near a side window, his movements calculated as he disabled one of the intruders. Simon, ever the professional, methodically picked off another, his calm precision a stark contrast to the chaos. But the attackers were persistent. As the fight dragged on, they adapted, forcing Edward and Simon to retreat deeper into the house. The safe house's layout worked in their favor, creating bottlenecks that allowed them to hold the line. "Two left," Simon said, reloading his weapon. "They're regrouping." Edward nodded, his focus unbroken. "We end this now." In a coordinated move, Edward and Simon flanked the remaining intruders, catching them off guard. The fight ended quickly, leaving the house eerily quiet once more. When the dust settled, Edward and Simon secured the area, ensuring no threats remained. Only then did Edward unlock the panic room, revealing Claire and Mary huddled together. "It's over," Edward said, his voice steady. "You're safe." Mary rushed to him, her arms wrapping around his waist. "I was so scared." Edward hugged her tightly, his resolve firm. "I told you, I won't let anything happen to you." Claire stepped forward, her eyes filled with gratitude. "Thank you. For everything." Edward met her gaze, his determination unwavering. "This isn't over. But we're not backing down. Not now. Not ever." As the first light of dawn crept over the mountains, the group knew their fight was far from finished. But they also knew they had something more powerful than fear, each other. The dawn brought a fragile calm to the safe house, the golden light streaming through the windows in stark contrast to the chaos of the night before. Edward stood outside on the porch, scanning the tree line with a cup of coffee in hand. Simon joined him a moment later, his expression as unreadable as ever. "We handled the immediate threat," Simon said, his voice low. "But they'll send more. They won't stop until they've neutralized every loose end." Edward nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Then we make sure we're not the loose ends anymore. We have to end this, for good." Simon leaned against the porch railing, glancing back toward the house. "Claire and Mary have been through enough. If we're going to draw this fight out, we need to keep them out of the line of fire." "They're not leaving," Edward replied firmly. "Not until this is over. Mary's been through too much to run now, and Claire's testimony is still our strongest weapon." Simon studied Edward for a moment before nodding. "Then we need a new strategy." Edward sipped his coffee, his mind already churning. "We take the fight to them. We force their hand before they can regroup." Simon smirked faintly. "You're proposing an offensive?" "Exactly," Edward said, his voice hardening. "We've been reacting for too long. It's time to take control." Inside the safe house, Claire sat at the table with Mary, going through a digital copy of her testimony. The evidence they had released was already making waves, with authorities launching investigations and public opinion turning sharply against Richard's network. But the danger still loomed, and Claire could feel it pressing down on her. Mary looked up from the screen, her brow furrowed. "Mom, do you think this will really change anything? I mean, all of this?" Claire reached across the table, taking Mary's hand in hers. "I do. It might take time, but the truth is out there now. They can't hide anymore." "But what if they come back?" Mary asked, her voice trembling. "Like last night?" Claire hesitated, her own fears mirrored in her daughter's eyes. "Then we'll be ready. Edward and Simon won't let anything happen to us." Mary nodded slowly, her determination returning. "Neither will I." Edward and Simon re-entered the house, their presence immediately drawing Claire's attention. "What's the plan?" she asked, her tone steady despite the tension in her voice. Edward pulled up a chair, leaning forward. We're going to strike first. Richard's network is already fractured, but we need to dismantle what's left before they can regroup. That means taking out key players, his backers, his enforcers, anyone who can keep the operation alive. Simon added, we've identified 3 critical targets. 2 are high-level financiers who've been funneling money into Richard's operations for years. The 3rd is a logistics coordinator who oversees their movements. Claire's face tightened. How do you know where to find them? Simon tapped his tablet, displaying maps and files. Richard's people aren't as careful as they think. We've been tracking their communications. We know where they are, and we know their vulnerabilities. Edward glanced at Claire. This won't be easy. But if we don't act now, they'll come for us again. And next time, they might bring more than a few hired guns. Claire nodded, her resolve hardening. What do you need me to do? Edward's gaze softened. Stay here. Keep Mary safe. Simon and I will handle this. Mary stood abruptly, her fists clenched. I want to help. Edward shook his head. Not this time, Mary. This is dangerous, and I need you here. Your mom needs you here. Mary's lip quivered, but she nodded reluctantly. Okay. Just, promise me you'll come back. Edward crouched to her level, placing a hand on her shoulder. I promise. The first target was a financier named Victor Lang, a wealthy businessman who operated out of a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city. Edward and Simon arrived under the cover of night, their approach calculated and precise. Simon disabled the estate's perimeter security while Edward scoped out the building. They moved quickly, avoiding guards as they infiltrated the main house. When they found Lang in his office, the confrontation was swift. Lang tried to feign ignorance, but Edward wasn't in the mood for games. You've been funding Richard's operations for years, Edward said coldly. That ends now. Lang stammered, his bravado crumbling under Edward's glare. I was just a middleman. I didn't know. You knew, Edward interrupted, his voice like ice. And now you're going to tell us everything. Names, accounts, operations. Simon leaned in, his tone calm but menacing. Or we turn everything we know about you over to the authorities. And trust me, they'll be very interested. Lang, realizing he had no way out, caved. He handed over files, passwords, and names, his hands shaking as he complied. As Edward and Simon left the estate, Simon glanced at him. 1 down. 2 to go. The second and third targets fell in quick succession, their operations dismantled with the same precision. By the time Edward and Simon returned to the safe house, they carried with them a wealth of information that would further cripple Richard's network. Mary rushed to the door as they entered, relief flooding her face. You're okay. Edward nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. We're okay. And we're winning. Claire joined them, her eyes scanning the files Simon carried. Is it enough? Edward met her gaze, his voice steady. It's more than enough. Richard's network is finished. For the first time, the weight pressing on them seemed to lift. The fight wasn't over, but the end was finally in sight. The safe house was alive with cautious optimism. Edward and Simon had delivered a decisive blow to Richard's network, but the looming threat still hung in the air. The evidence they'd gathered from the 3 dismantled operations had given them a clearer picture of Richard's inner circle and its remaining players. Now, it was a matter of sealing the deal. Edward sat at the table, poring over the documents Simon had spread out. Bank statements, transaction logs, and communications pointed to a final meeting scheduled between Richard's remaining allies. It was clear, this was their chance to cut the head off the snake. Simon tapped the map in front of him. This meeting is their last-ditch effort to reorganize. If we strike here, we can ensure there's nothing left to rebuild. Claire, standing nearby with her arms crossed, looked uneasy. And what happens if you're wrong? What if they're expecting you? Edward looked up, his expression calm but resolute. We don't have a choice. If they get back on their feet, they'll come for us, and for anyone else in their way. This ends now. Mary, sitting quietly next to Claire, spoke up. I know you'll stop them. You always do. Her voice, steady despite her young age, brought a faint smile to Edward's face. Thanks, Mary. But this time, we're making sure it's permanent. The meeting was set to take place in an abandoned industrial site on the outskirts of the city. Edward and Simon prepared meticulously, knowing the stakes were higher than ever. They loaded their gear into the SUV, double-checking every detail before setting out. Before leaving, Edward pulled Claire aside. If anything happens, Simon set up a secure line for you and Mary. He'll get you to safety. Claire's eyes narrowed. Don't talk like you're not coming back. Mary's counting on you. I'll come back, Edward said firmly. I always do. He crouched down to Mary, who was clutching the locket around her neck. Keep this safe for me, he said with a small smile. Mary nodded, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I will. With one last glance at them, Edward and Simon headed out into the night. The industrial site was eerily quiet, its rusted structures casting long shadows under the faint glow of security lights. Edward and Simon parked a safe distance away, moving in on foot to avoid detection. Through binoculars, they observed the meeting. Richard's remaining allies had gathered around a makeshift table inside a large warehouse, their voices low but tense. Armed guards patrolled the perimeter, their movements methodical. Simon whispered, 8 guards outside. 4 more inside. The targets are clustered in the center. Edward nodded, his voice equally low. We take out the guards first. Quietly. Then we force the targets to talk. Simon smirked faintly. Just like old times. The 2 men moved with practiced precision, taking out the guards one by one. Edward's movements were silent but swift, his focus unyielding. Simon covered him from a distance, ensuring none of the guards had a chance to sound the alarm. When the perimeter was clear, they entered the warehouse. The targets were deep in discussion, unaware of the approaching threat. Edward and Simon positioned themselves strategically before making their move. Gentlemen, Edward called out, his voice cold and sharp. The men at the table froze, their heads snapping toward him. It's over. One of the men, a grizzled figure in a suit, sneered. You think you can just walk in here and... Edward fired a warning shot into the air, silencing him. Yes, I can. And I just did. Sit down. The men complied, their bravado quickly replaced by fear. Simon moved to cover them, his weapon trained on the group as Edward approached the table. You've been funding and protecting Richard Hale for years, Edward said, his voice cutting through the tension. That ends now. You're going to give me everything, names, accounts, operations, or this gets a lot worse for you. One of the younger men stammered, we didn't know it would come to this. Spare me, Edward interrupted, slamming a folder of evidence onto the table. We have everything we need to take you down. But if you cooperate, maybe you'll get a deal. The men exchanged nervous glances before one of them, clearly the leader, spoke. What do you want? Everything, Edward said. And you're going to call off anyone who's still loyal to Richard. Tonight. Under Simon's watchful eye, the men complied, handing over information and making the necessary calls to dismantle the remnants of Richard's operations. The tension in the warehouse was palpable, but Edward remained calm, methodical. When the last call was made, Edward stepped back. Congratulations. You just saved yourselves a lot of trouble. But if I hear a whisper of you trying to rebuild, I'll make sure you regret it. With that, he and Simon exited the warehouse, leaving the men shaken and defeated. As they drove away, Simon glanced at Edward. That felt good. Edward smirked faintly. It's not over yet. But we're close. Back at the safe house, Claire and Mary waited anxiously. When the sound of the SUV pulling up reached them, Mary bolted to the door, relief flooding her face as Edward and Simon stepped inside. You did it? Mary asked, her voice filled with hope. Edward nodded, placing a hand on her shoulder. We did it. Claire approached, her eyes searching his. Is it really over? Edward met her gaze, his voice steady. Not completely. But the worst of it is. They're finished. For the first time, the safe house felt lighter, the weight of fear lifting. They had fought hard, and while the road ahead still held challenges, they were ready to face it together. The morning after Edward and Simon dismantled Richard's remaining network, the safe house was filled with an unfamiliar quiet. The weight that had pressed on them for weeks seemed lighter, though no one dared say it aloud. Claire moved around the kitchen, making breakfast for Mary, who sat at the table, flipping through the photos they had been organizing the day before. Edward and Simon were seated in the living room, their focus on a laptop displaying news headlines. The takedown was making waves, with authorities confirming the arrests of several high-ranking individuals from Richard's network. Public outrage continued to grow, and investigative reporters dug deeper into the story, exposing years of corruption. Simon glanced at Edward. It's unraveling faster than I expected. They're turning on each other to save their own skin. That's the goal, Edward replied, his tone calm but firm. The more chaos among them, the less chance they have to regroup. Claire entered, carrying plates of toast and eggs. She set them down in front of Edward and Simon, her expression a mix of determination and exhaustion. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. Edward shook his head. You don't have to thank us. This was about more than just stopping Richard. It was about giving you and Mary your lives back. Mary piped up from the table, her voice filled with hope. Does this mean we can go home? Like, a real home? Claire hesitated, glancing at Edward. He met her gaze, understanding the unspoken question. Not yet, he said gently. There are still loose ends. But we're close. I promise. Later that day, Simon received an encrypted message on his tablet. His brow furrowed as he read it, drawing Edward's attention. What is it? Edward asked. Simon turned the screen toward him. It's from one of my contacts in the intelligence community. They've located Richard. Edward's jaw tightened. Where? Simon tapped the screen, pulling up a map. An offshore facility. Private, heavily guarded. Looks like his backers stashed him there to keep him quiet. Claire, overhearing from the other room, stepped in. What does that mean? Are they hiding him, or? Both, Simon replied. They know he's a liability. If the authorities get to him, he could take the whole operation down. Edward leaned back, his mind racing. If we can get to him first, we can force him to talk. Publicly. That'll bring the rest of them down. Claire's face paled. You're going after him? After everything you've already done? Edward's voice was steady. We have to. This is our chance to finish it. Mary stood, crossing the room to stand beside Claire. Can I help? I know I can't go, but maybe there's something I can do here. Edward smiled faintly, placing a hand on her shoulder. You've already helped more than you know. Just stay here and keep your mom safe. That's the most important thing. Mary nodded, her resolve unshaken. Okay. But be careful. The offshore facility was as formidable as Simon had described. Situated on a remote island, it was surrounded by high walls and patrolled by armed guards. Edward and Simon approached under the cover of darkness, using a small boat to avoid detection. Once ashore, They moved quickly, evading the guards and slipping through the facility's outer defenses. Simon monitored their progress through a handheld device, mapping out the guards' movements and guiding Edward to Richard's location. Inside the main building, they found Richard in a secure room, pacing nervously. He looked up in shock as Edward and Simon entered, his face pale. "Edward," Richard stammered, his voice shaky. I didn't think you'd." Edward cut him off, his voice cold. "You thought you could run? Hide behind your backers while they cleaned up your mess." Richard raised his hands in surrender. "I didn't have a choice. They forced me to." "Save it," Edward snapped. "We're past excuses. You're going to tell the world everything you know, or I'll make sure you disappear for good." Richard's eyes darted between Edward and Simon, his bravado crumbling. "If I talk, they'll kill me." Simon stepped closer, his voice calm but deadly. "If you don't talk, we'll let them have you. Your choice." Richard hesitated, sweat beading on his forehead. Finally, he nodded. "Fine. I'll talk. Just, get me out of here." Edward didn't flinch. "You'll get out when we're done. Not before." By the time Edward and Simon returned to the safe house, dawn was breaking. They entered quietly, but Mary, already awake, ran to greet them. "Did you find him?" she asked, her eyes wide. Edward nodded. "We did. And he's agreed to testify." Claire joined them, relief washing over her face. "It's really over, isn't it?" Edward exchanged a glance with Simon before answering. "Almost. Once his testimony is public, they won't be able to hide. But we'll stay vigilant, just in case." Mary smiled, hugging Claire tightly. "We can finally stop running." Edward watched them, a faint smile crossing his face. The battle had been long and grueling, but the light at the end of the tunnel was finally within reach. For the first time in years, it felt like hope wasn't just a fleeting dream, it was a promise. The safe house had transformed into a hub of activity. Simon worked tirelessly at his laptop, coordinating the logistics for Richard's testimony, while Edward reviewed the documents they had recovered. The walls seemed to hum with the tension of impending action, yet there was also a palpable sense of hope. An end was finally in sight. Claire stood in the kitchen, making coffee for the group, her hands steady for the first time in weeks. Mary sat at the table, helping Simon organize files, her young face glowing with purpose. Edward glanced at her from across the room, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Despite everything, Mary had found a strength that inspired everyone around her. Simon's voice broke the quiet. "The arrangements are set. Richard's testimony will go live tomorrow morning. I've secured an encrypted connection with a trusted journalist. Once it's out, there's no taking it back." Edward nodded, his expression serious. "What about protection? If Richard's backers get wind of this before it's public?" "They won't," Simon interrupted. "The location is secure, and I've got backup on standby. If anyone makes a move, we'll know." Claire joined them, handing Edward a cup of coffee. "And us? What happens once the testimony goes out?" Edward looked at her, his voice calm but firm. "We stay put for now. Let the dust settle. Once it's safe, we'll figure out the next step." Mary looked up from her work, her voice quiet but resolute. "Does this mean we can finally go home?" Edward's gaze softened. "Soon, Mary. I promise." That evening, Richard arrived at the safe house under heavy security. He looked disheveled and nervous, his usual arrogance replaced by a jittery unease. Edward and Simon escorted him inside, their expressions cold and unyielding. Claire, seeing him for the first time since the chaos began, stiffened. Her voice was sharp. "You have a lot to answer for." Richard avoided her gaze, mumbling, "I'm doing what I can now." Mary stood beside Claire, her eyes narrowing. "Too little, too late." Edward stepped between them, his voice cutting through the tension. Focus. We need his testimony, and we need it clean. Save the anger for later. Richard sat down at the table, fidgeting as Simon set up the recording equipment. The room was silent as the camera began to roll, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Simon's voice was steady as he spoke. State your name and your role in Richard Hale's network. Richard hesitated, then sighed. My name is Richard Hale. I was the head of an organization that facilitated money laundering, fraud, and corruption at the highest levels of government and business. Edward stood just out of frame, his arms crossed. List the individuals involved. All of them. Richard's voice shook as he began naming names, each one more damning than the last. He detailed the web of corruption that had spanned years, implicating powerful figures who had operated in the shadows for far too long. By the time he finished, the room was heavy with the weight of his confession. Simon ended the recording, immediately encrypting the file and preparing it for release. Richard slumped in his chair, his hands trembling. They're going to come for me now. You know that, right? Edward's voice was cold. That's not my problem. Claire stepped forward, her voice cutting through the tension. It's not enough. You destroyed lives, Richard. Saying sorry on camera doesn't fix that. Richard looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of regret and fear. I know. But maybe this will stop them from hurting anyone else. The next morning, the testimony went live. Major news outlets picked up the story within minutes, the video spreading across social media like wildfire. The world watched as Richard's confession laid bare the corruption that had been hidden for so long. Protests erupted in cities worldwide, demanding accountability from the powerful figures implicated in the scandal. At the safe house, the group gathered around the television, watching the fallout unfold. Mary sat between Claire and Edward, her small hand gripping her mother's tightly. Is it really over? She asked, her voice trembling with hope. Edward looked at her, his expression softening. It's over for Richard and his people. But we'll need to stay careful. There are still others out there who won't like what's happened. Simon turned from his laptop, his tone reassuring. The evidence is solid. With public pressure this strong, the authorities have no choice but to act. This is the beginning of the end for them. Claire exhaled deeply, the tension in her shoulders easing for the first time in months. Then maybe we can finally breathe. Edward placed a hand on her shoulder, his voice steady. You can. For now, you're safe. As night fell, the safe house grew quiet once again. Mary was the first to drift off to sleep, her head resting on Claire's lap as they sat on the couch. Claire gently stroked her daughter's hair, a small smile playing on her lips. Edward and Simon stood near the window, their voices low as they discussed the next steps. Simon's tone was practical. We'll monitor the situation for a few more days. If everything holds steady, you can move them somewhere permanent. Edward nodded, his gaze shifting to Claire and Mary. They deserve that. A fresh start. Simon smirked faintly. So do you. Edward didn't respond, his focus on the family he had come to care for deeply. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, it felt like the worst was behind them. And in that moment, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope, for a future free of fear and filled with possibility. The safe house woke to a cautious calm the next morning. The tension that had gripped them for weeks seemed to ease as the world responded to Richard's testimony. News outlets were filled with updates about the arrests of powerful figures, while social media buzzed with calls for justice. It was as if a veil had been lifted, exposing the corruption Edward and his team had fought so hard to uncover. Mary was the first to rise, her youthful energy restored after weeks of fear and sleepless nights. She padded into the kitchen, where Edward was already sipping his coffee, staring out the window at the tranquil mountain landscape. Good morning, she said softly, her voice tentative. Edward turned, his expression softening when he saw her. "Morning, Mary. Did you sleep well?" She nodded, sliding into a chair at the table. "Better than I have in a long time." Claire appeared moments later, her hair pulled back and her face brighter than it had been in months. She leaned against the counter, watching Mary pour herself a glass of juice. "This feels strange," Claire admitted, her voice tinged with wonder. "Not being afraid, I mean." Edward smiled faintly, setting his mug down. "You should get used to it. That's what all this was for, to give you and Mary a life where you don't have to look over your shoulder." Mary looked up from her drink, her voice filled with curiosity. "What about you? What happens now?" Edward hesitated, his gaze flicking to Claire, then back to Mary. "That depends. There's still work to be done. But for now, I'm staying right here. At least until I know you're truly safe." Claire's eyes softened, gratitude evident in her expression. "You've done more for us than we could ever repay, Edward." "You don't owe me anything," Edward replied firmly. This was about setting things right. Simon entered, carrying his ever-present tablet. He placed it on the table, his expression unreadable. "The fallout is spreading. More arrests, more leaks." Richard's testimony opened a floodgate. Claire tensed. "Does that mean they'll come after us?" Simon shook his head. "Not likely. The public spotlight is too strong. Anyone who tries to retaliate now risks exposing themselves further. But we'll stay cautious." Edward nodded, his focus returning to Simon. "What's the next step?" Simon pulled up a map on the tablet, showing a remote property surrounded by forest. "This is a location I've been working on. It's off the grid, fully secure. A permanent place for Claire and Mary. If you're ready, we can move them there within the week." Claire frowned. "You mean leave here? Now?" Simon nodded. "The safe house was always temporary. With the heat dying down, this is your chance for a real fresh start." Mary's face lit up. "A real home?" Edward smiled at her enthusiasm. "That's the idea. A place where you can start over." Claire hesitated, her gaze flicking between Edward and Simon. "And what about you? Will you stay with us?" Edward's smile faltered slightly, but his voice was steady. "I'll make sure you're settled. After that, we'll see." Preparations for the move began immediately. Edward and Simon ensured the new location was ready, reinforcing its defenses and stocking it with everything Claire and Mary would need. As the days passed, the safe house became a flurry of quiet activity, with everyone focused on the transition. On the final night at the safe house, the group gathered around the fire pit outside, the mountain air crisp and still. Mary roasted marshmallows, her laughter filling the space as Claire helped her avoid burning them. Simon sat nearby, occasionally glancing at his tablet, while Edward watched the flames, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Claire noticed his distant expression and sat beside him. "Penny for your thoughts." Edward chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Just thinking about everything that's happened. How close we came to losing all of this." Claire followed his gaze to Mary, her daughter's happiness lighting up the night. "But we didn't. Because of you. Because of all of us," Edward corrected. "This wasn't something I could have done alone." Claire placed a hand on his arm, her voice soft. "You gave us hope when we had none. Don't downplay that." Edward met her eyes, a rare vulnerability in his expression. "I just wanted to make things right." "And you did," Claire said firmly. "For Mary. For me. And for yourself." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the fire crackling softly between them. In the distance, the first stars began to emerge, twinkling against the darkening sky. The next morning, the move began. Simon drove the SUV with Claire and Mary inside, while Edward followed in another vehicle, carrying their belongings. The journey to the new home was quiet, each mile feeling like a step closer to freedom. When they arrived, the sight of the house took Mary's breath away. It was a modest but beautiful cabin, surrounded by towering trees and open fields. A small creek ran nearby, its gentle burbling adding to the serenity of the setting. "It's perfect," Mary whispered, her eyes wide with wonder. Claire smiled, her own relief evident. "It really is." Edward and Simon unloaded the vehicles, helping them settle into their new home. By the time the sun began to set, the cabin felt warm and lived in, a sanctuary after so much turmoil. As Edward prepared to leave that evening, Mary ran to him, hugging him tightly. "You'll visit, right?" Edward knelt, his voice soft but steady. "Of course I will. You're stuck with me, kid." Claire stood in the doorway, watching as Edward and Simon got into their vehicle. Her eyes glistened, but her smile was bright. "Thank you. For everything." Edward nodded, his voice quiet. "Take care of each other." As he drove away, the cabin grew smaller in the rearview mirror, but the sense of peace remained. For the first time in years, Edward felt like he had truly made a difference, and he knew the best was yet to come. The drive away from the cabin was quiet, the hum of the engine filling the space between Edward and Simon. The forest surrounding them seemed endless, its dense greenery a fitting backdrop for the sense of closure Edward felt. Yet, as the road stretched on, a weight lingered in his chest, part relief, part uncertainty. Simon broke the silence first, his voice steady but reflective. "You did it, you know. Gave them a chance to live without fear." Edward nodded, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. "It was never just about them. Stopping Richard, taking down his network, was something I owed myself to. For all the times I looked the other way." Simon glanced at him, his usual smirk softening into something more genuine. "You could have walked away at any point. No one would have blamed you." Edward shook his head. "Walking away isn't an option when you're the reason some of those mistakes happened in the first place." Simon didn't argue. Instead, he settled back in his seat, allowing Edward the space to process everything in his own time. Weeks passed, and life began to settle into a rhythm. Claire and Mary embraced their new home, the days filled with quiet routines and small joys. Mary began exploring the nearby woods, her laughter often echoing through the trees as she discovered new trails and hidden clearings. Claire, meanwhile, threw herself into the process of rebuilding her life, finding ways to connect with the world again without the shadow of fear hanging over her. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of gold and orange, a familiar figure arrived at the cabin. Edward stepped out of his car, a small bag slung over his shoulder. Mary spotted him first, running from the porch with an excited shout. "You came back," she exclaimed, throwing her arms around him. Edward hugged her tightly, a smile breaking through his usually reserved expression. "Of course I did. I promised, didn't I?" Claire appeared in the doorway, her face lighting up as she saw him. "Edward. It's good to see you." He nodded, walking toward her. "I figured I'd check in. Make sure you're settling in okay." "We're more than okay," Claire said warmly. "But come in. You're staying for dinner." The evening was filled with laughter and warmth. Around the dinner table, the three of them shared stories, joked about Mary's adventures in the woods, and spoke of their hopes for the future. It was a stark contrast to the tension and fear that had once defined their lives, and for Edward, it was a reminder of why he had fought so hard. As the night wore on, Edward found himself sitting on the porch with Claire, the stars twinkling overhead. Mary had gone to bed, her soft snores audible through the open window. Claire turned to him, her voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "I don't know where we'd be if it weren't for you. You gave us a chance to live again." Edward shook his head, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You gave yourselves that chance. All I did was push things in the right direction." Claire placed a hand on his arm, drawing his attention to her. You did more than that. You stayed when you didn't have to. You fought for us. That means something. He looked at her, his usual guarded expression softening. It means something to me too. For a moment, they sat in silence, the weight of their shared history settling between them. It wasn't a burden, it was a bond. The next morning, as the sun rose over the cabin, Edward prepared to leave again. Mary hugged him tightly at the door, her voice filled with determination. You'll come back soon, right? Always, Edward promised, ruffling her hair. Claire walked him to his car, her arms crossed but her smile warm. Take care of yourself, Edward. You've earned that. He nodded, his gaze lingering on her. So have you. Both of you. As he drove away, the cabin disappeared into the distance, but the peace it represented stayed with him. For the first time in years, Edward felt like he could breathe. The battles he had fought, the demons he had faced, they didn't define him anymore. He wasn't running. He wasn't chasing. He was simply living. And as the road stretched out before him, Edward knew that wherever it led, he had finally found something worth holding on to: hope, family, and the promise of a better tomorrow.